I thought my dad was the one person I could always rely on. That belief shattered the day he sold the lakeside cottage my grandparents had left me. It wasn't just a house on the water. It was worth $2.5 million, but to me, its value was far beyond money. Every corner held a memory. Every creak of the old wooden floor reminded me of summers filled with laughter, campfires, and the quiet love of the two people who had always believed in me. When my father told me about the sale, he didn't even sound sorry. He handed me a check for $10,000 and said, "It's time you start fresh." His words felt like a slap. I wasn't being given a chance to start anything. I was being robbed of the only inheritance that carried meaning. My name is Eleanor Hart. I'm 32, and I live a modest life. I teach, I budget carefully, and I've never needed luxury. The cottage wasn't a prize to me. It was home. It was where I learned how to fish with my grandfather at dawn, and where my grandmother taught me to bake pies in the tiny old kitchen. That cottage was the last piece of them I had left. My father, Martin Hart, 61, has always been a man people admire from the outside. He is charming in public, smooth when he speaks, and always seems to know how to win others over. But behind that polished image, there has always been something darker. He has a way of twisting situations so that he is in control. He masks it under the excuse of protecting family interests. But I know now it was never about family. It was about power. That day, when he handed me the check, it became clear. I had lost not just the house, but my trust in him. Everything I thought I knew about loyalty between a father and daughter was broken in a single moment. The cottage had always felt like a second home to me. It sat quietly by the water, with tall pines standing guard around it, and a small dock that stretched just far enough for us to sit with our feet in the lake. I grew up visiting it every summer, and those visits became the happiest parts of my childhood. My grandparents loved that place. They poured their time and care into every corner, treating it as more than a building. To them, it was a place where family could gather, laugh, and rest from the world outside. When I was little, my grandfather would wake me up before the sun came up. He would already have the fishing rods ready, and we would walk together down to the dock. The air was always cool at that hour, and I remember how he would put his hand on my shoulder to steady me as I stumbled sleepily along. We would sit quietly with the water smooth as glass, waiting for the first tug on the line. He wasn't just teaching me how to fish. He was teaching me patience, how to enjoy the stillness, how to listen to the sounds of nature. Inside the cottage, my grandmother made sure there was always something sweet baking in the oven. She would let me stand on a chair beside her, my hands covered in flour as I tried to follow her careful instructions. I can still see the way she'd smile when I got it wrong, never scolding, just gently showing me how to try again. Those pies we baked together weren't just food. They carried love in every bite, and whenever the smell filled the small kitchen, I felt safe. The cottage was full of little details that made it feel alive. The old rocking chair on the porch that creaked no matter how carefully you sat down. The hand-sewn quilts folded neatly in the bedroom. The narrow staircase that groaned under our feet as we ran up and down. Each piece of it held the mark of my grandparents' hands and hearts. They always told me that one day it would be mine, that it was meant to stay in the family through. I believed them completely, and I carried that promise close to me as I grew older. When my grandparents passed, they made it clear that the cottage was meant for me. I was still young then, just finishing college, and I didn't know much about legal matters. My father stepped in, saying it would be easier if he managed the detail. He told me it was complicated, that handling property involved paperwork I wouldn't understand. I never questioned him. He was my father, and I trusted him without hesitation. I thought he was helping me, protecting what was meant to be mine until I was ready to handle it myself. For years, I believed the cottage was safe. I thought it would always be waiting for me, the way it had during my childhood summers. I held on to the idea that one day I would bring my own children there, show them how to fish at dawn, teach them to bake pies in that same kitchen. I trusted that my father had kept his word. I had no reason to doubt him, because in my mind, family came first. One afternoon, I received a call from an old neighbor who still lived near the lake. Her voice carried hesitation, like she didn't want to be the one to tell me. She said she had seen moving trucks parked outside the cottage. Men were carrying out boxes, furniture, even the old rocking chair from the porch. At first I thought she must be mistaken. There was no reason anyone should be inside that house without me. But when I drove out there, my heart dropped the moment I turned down the familiar road. The driveway was crowded with workers. They moved quickly, lifting and loading pieces of my grandparents' life into the back of a truck, as if it were all just junk. I stood frozen, watching strangers carry out the quilts my grandmother had folded so carefully, the fishing rods my grandfather had set aside for me, the little wooden table we had eaten countless meals on. It felt like I was standing in a nightmare, like at any moment someone would tell me it wasn't real. I tried to stop them, but the men only shrugged and said they were hired to do a job. My hands shook as I called my father. He didn't answer the first time, or the second. Finally, after the third attempt, he picked up with a calm voice, as if nothing unusual was happening. I demanded to know what was going on, why our home was being emptied. His answer came with no hesitation, no shame. "I sold it," he said flatly. "You don't need a place like that. You need stability, not memories. It's done." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The words didn't make sense. I stammered something about the will, about how it was supposed to be mine. He didn't argue the point, didn't even try to soften the blow. Instead, he told me he had already taken care of everything, that the papers were signed and there was nothing left to discuss. Then he added, almost casually, "I've set aside some money for you, $10,000. That's more than enough for you to live responsibly." I felt my knees weaken. $10,000, as if that could replace generations of memories, as if it could make up for the years I had trusted him. His tone was cold, final, almost patronizing, like he was teaching me some kind of lesson. I tried to speak, but my throat closed up. He ended the call before I could say more. I stood there by the trucks, powerless as they drove away with everything that once made the cottage feel alive. I had no authority to stop them, no proof to fight back in that moment. All I could do was watch. My chest ached in a way I can't even describe, a mix of humiliation and heartbreak. It wasn't only the loss of the house. It was the sharp realization that the person I had trusted most had taken it from me without hesitation. After that day, it felt like a weight had settled on my chest that wouldn't lift. At night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, seeing my grandparents' faces. I imagined how disappointed they would be if they knew what had happened. They had worked so hard to leave something behind for me, something that carried their love. Now it was gone, not because of strangers, but because of my own father. That thought cut deeper than anything else. I cried often, not the kind of tears that come quickly and fade, but the quiet kind that leave you drained for hours. In the silence, I could hear my grandmother's voice calling me into the kitchen, or my grandfather's laugh echoing across the lake. Those memories felt almost cruel now. What was once comforting became a reminder of everything I no longer had. Life outside the cottage was far less forgiving. I found myself moving into a small apartment that barely held my things. The paint was chipped, the heat never worked right, and the sound of traffic outside replaced the peaceful rhythm of waves I had grown up hearing. Every paycheck from teaching went straight to rent, bills, and groceries. I tried to stretch every dollar, but it was never enough to feel comfortable. Meanwhile, my father continued to live as if nothing had happened. He traveled, wore expensive suits, and spoke proudly to others about his business sense. I avoided family gatherings because watching him boast while I struggled was unbearable. He carried himself with pride while I felt like I was shrinking inside my own skin. The hardest part came when family friends began to ask questions. Some didn't know the truth. They assumed I had agreed to sell. They asked why I let it go, why I hadn't kept it the way my grandparents wanted. Their voices weren't cruel, but their words felt heavy. Each question made me feel smaller, like I had failed to honor the people who had loved me most. I didn't know how to answer. Should I tell them my father had betrayed me? Should I admit I had trusted him too much? I usually mumbled something vague, then found a reason to leave the conversation. Shame followed me everywhere. It wasn't only about losing the cottage, it was about the way it happened. I felt foolish for handing over control, for not questioning him when I should have. Every time I thought about it, I replayed the choices I had made and wondered how I could have been so blind. The days grew longer as I worked extra hours, trying to make ends meet. My body was tired, my mind worn down, but the ache in my heart was what consumed me the most. I missed the sound of the water, the smell of pine, the warmth of my grandparents' kitchen. And every time I remembered, the betrayal settled deeper inside me, becoming a pain I carried wherever I went. The more I tried to move on, the more unsettled I became. Something about the way the cottage was taken didn't sit right with me. My father's tone, the swiftness of the sale, the workers removing every trace of our family, it all felt too planned. I kept asking myself why he was so quick to dismiss my questions, why he acted as though it was none of my concern. Deep down, I knew there had to be more to the story. My suspicion grew stronger when I overheard a conversation between two former neighbors at the grocery store. They mentioned Harold Whitaker, a local businessman known for shady dealings, had recently acquired a lakeside property for a price that sounded far too low. My stomach tightened at the name. I knew Harold from passing. He had always hovered around town, making quiet deals that left others whispering. When I asked more, they said the property was mine. The realization hit like ice in my veins. I couldn't rest until I knew the truth. I dug into public records, searching for details of the sale. What I found stunned me. The cottage had been transferred for a fraction of its real worth. It wasn't just sold, it was handed off at a bargain. My father had practically given it away. But as I read further, I realized it wasn't charity. There were side agreements attached, hidden payments that went directly to him. He had taken something priceless from me and turned it into profit for himself. I stared at the documents for hours, barely able to breathe. Each page showed signatures, legal wording, and arrangements that I had never seen. Buried in the details was something even more painful. Years ago, when the will was executed, my father had placed clauses in the paperwork that left him with control over the property. He had disguised it as a way to help manage things while I was still young. In reality, he had built himself a door he could walk through whenever he wanted, without needing my approval. I remembered the way I had trusted him when he said it was complicated, the way I had believed him when he promised it was in my best interest. Looking at the evidence now, I felt sick. He hadn't just betrayed me in the present. He had been planning this since the beginning. Every handshake, every signature, every word of reassurance had been another step toward stripping me of what my grandparents wanted me to have. The betrayal felt deeper than before. It wasn't only about money. It was about erasing a part of me, the one link I still had to the two people who raised me with love and kindness. My father had traded those memories for a deal with Harold Whitaker, as if they meant nothing at all. I sat alone at my kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, my hands trembling. The grief I had been carrying turned into something sharper, heavier. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of anger rising through the heartbreak. I wanted to storm into my father's house and scream at him for what he had done, but something inside told me not to. If I let anger take control, he would dismiss me the way he always had, with a smile and a speech about how he knew best. I needed more than words. I needed proof. I needed a way to strike back that he couldn't brush off or explain away. Not long after, I crossed paths with someone I hadn't expected, Clara Whitaker. She was Harold's daughter, though you wouldn't know it by the way she spoke about him. Clara and I met at a small cafe in town after running into each other by chance. We recognized each other from years ago, but our conversation quickly turned serious. She had grown up watching her father's business dealing and wanted nothing to do with them. The bitterness in her voice was clear when she said, "He ruins people for money. That's all he cares about." Her honesty surprised me. I hesitated at first, unsure if I should share my story, but something in her expression told me she would understand. When I mentioned the cottage, her face hardened. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "I know exactly what they did," she said. She explained that Harold had been working with my father for years, using false property valuations to secure land for less than it was worth. The cottage wasn't their first scheme. It was just one of many. Clara despised the way her father operated. She had walked away from him long ago, but she still knew where to look for his secret. Slowly, she began sharing pieces of information with me. Names, numbers, copies of records she managed to get her hands on. Each detail added weight to the growing pile of evidence. At first, it was small things: irregular tax filings, sudden transfers of large sums, signatures that didn't match. But soon, patterns emerged. Deals were linked together, showing years of manipulation. I started keeping everything organized in a binder, each page another piece of the puzzle. I spent evenings at my kitchen table, the papers spread out before me, a pen in hand to mark connections. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that my father and Harold had built an empire of lies. They didn't just cheat me, they had cheated others too, hiding behind charm and polished words. The process gave me a strange sense of strength. For the first time since the cottage was taken, I felt less powerless. I wasn't rushing into anything. I wasn't screaming into the void. I was building something steady, something that could not be ignored. Clara encouraged me, reminding me that exposing them would not only bring justice for me, but also for others who had been fooled. As the evidence piled higher, I kept my silence around my father. When he called, I spoke politely, pretending nothing had changed. But behind that calm voice, I was sharpening my blade, piece by piece, preparing for the moment when he would finally see what he had done. When I felt I had gathered enough information to see the bigger picture, I knew I couldn't handle the next step alone. That was when I reached out to Daniel Reeves, a friend from college who had become an attorney. He was 35 now, sharp, steady, and someone I trusted. I hadn't spoken to him much in recent years, but when I explained what had happened, he didn't hesitate. "Bring me everything you have," he said. I carried the binder I had been filling for weeks into his office. We sat across from each other at his desk as I spread out the papers. He went through them carefully, line by line, sometimes stopping to ask a question or circle a note. The more he read, the more serious his face became. Finally, he leaned back and said, "Eleanor, this isn't just shady business. This is fraud. If we approach this the right way, your father and Harold could be in real trouble." Hearing those words was both frightening and relieving. For so long I had felt powerless, but now there was a chance to hold him accountable. Daniel explained that property fraud often left trails if you knew where to look. With the documents Clara had given me, plus the records I had found on my own, we had enough to start piecing together something strong. But he wanted to dig deeper. Over the next several weeks, Daniel and I worked side by side. He guided me on what to request from public offices, how to trace transfers, and what signs of tax evasion looked. I followed every instruction, determined to find more. It didn't take long before new layers appeared. My father hadn't only profited from selling the cottage, he had hidden money in accounts under different names, moving funds to avoid paying taxes. Some of the transfers linked directly to Harold's businesses, showing just how connected they were. Every discovery left me stunned. I had always known my father liked control, but I had never imagined he would risk everything by burying his wealth in. He had built his life on charm and reputation, yet behind it all was a maze of deceit. Daniel kept reminding me that patience was key. We needed everything organized, clear, and undeniable before taking it to the authorities. Piece by piece, the file grew thicker. Each page was labeled and backed with evidence, no guesswork, no gaps. Daniel even brought in a financial analyst to double-check the record, making sure we hadn't missed anything. The analyst confirmed what we feared. Martin Hart and Harold Whitaker had been running schemes for years, using undervalued properties, fake valuations, and hidden accounts to pocket money that never should have been there. By the time we were done, we had built something solid. It wasn't just a daughter accusing her father anymore. It was a case that showed clear violations, the kind that couldn't be ignored. Daniel believed the state would take interest once they saw it. For the first time, I felt like justice was within reach. My father had thought he could bury the truth, but now the truth was ready to rise against him. I accepted his dinner invitation without showing how much it shook me. His house smelled like lemon polish and cooked meat, the same careful order he always kept. He greeted me with the easy smile that had fooled so many people. He asked about my life, nodded at my answers, and steered the talk toward his recent deals, proud and relaxed. He talked about returns, tax strategy, and how he kept the family safe by making tough choices. His voice had that calm certainty I used to trust. I sat across from him, listening without interrupting. My hands were still from anger, but my face stayed steady. On the table between us, the china plates caught the light, ordinary and harmless. Like everything else he showed the world. He didn't notice the way my fingers tightened at the edge of my napkin. He told a story about negotiating a price, and how he knew when to close a sale. He laughed at his own cleverness and expected me to admire him. When the main course was over and the wine had been poured, I changed the tone of my voice to something softer. I told him I had questions about his recent choices. He waved them away at first, then leaned back, pleased with himself, ready to lecture about discipline. He began to list reasons he said justified his actions: stability, managing risk, protecting family assets from bad decisions. Each explanation was practiced, the same script he used when he wanted to control a room. I let him finish. Then, slowly, I told him I had been looking into the sale. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I said I had found documents and records that did not match his story. I mentioned transfers, odd valuations, and accounts with unfamiliar names. I watched his face while I spoke. At first it stayed as it always did, smooth, confident. Then a muscle in his jaw tightened. The smile faded. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure of what to say next. I told him I knew the deal with Harold, the low sale price, the payments that never showed up on regular statements. I explained I had copies of signed forms and emails that tied everything together. I wasn't there to beg. I was there to confront the man who had taken what mattered from me and pretended it was for my good. My words were plain and direct. They carried the weight of all the nights I had spent making sense of the papers on my kitchen table. His posture changed. The casual ease he wore like armor cracked, and panic slipped into his eyes. He tried to regain control with another practiced line about legal technicalities, but it sounded thin. I kept my voice quiet and steady. I told him I had already shown the evidence to someone who could act on it, and that I would not let him hide behind reputation and charm. When I finished, I leaned forward and said, without flourish, that he had taken a part of my life, and that I intended to see it set right. The silence that followed was heavy. He swallowed, searching for an angle, but found none that would hold. In that pause I saw the man who had always managed to smooth things over, stripped down to nerves and fear. I left the dinner table that night calm and resolved. I had taken the first step away from being powerless, and for the first time since the cottage was gone, I felt in control of what would come next. It began quietly, just a letter in the mail confirming that the state had taken interest in the file Daniel submitted. Weeks passed with little news, and then one morning the phone rang. Investigators wanted to meet with me. I carried my binder into their office, the same way I had carried it to Daniel's, and watched as they studied the pages. They didn't brush it aside. They asked pointed questions, copied documents, and promised to follow through. For the first time, I believed something real was about to happen. It didn't take long before the storm hit. The authorities moved quickly once they confirmed the trail of hidden money. Accounts were frozen. Notices were delivered. Harold's businesses were picked apart, and Martin's carefully polished image cracked open in public view. What had been whispers in town turned into headlines in the local paper. People who once praised my father's business sense now spoke his name with disgust. Harold faced the worst of it. Federal charges were filed against him for years of property fraud and tax evasion. His empire, built on shortcuts and lies, collapsed almost overnight. Clara, who had once walked away from him in shame, finally saw him answer for what he had done. As for my father, he was not charged on the same level, but the consequences stripped him of everything he had worked to protect. His accounts were drained, his retirement savings vanished, and every asset he thought was untouchable was seized. The man who once stood so tall with pride now had nothing to stand on. The community response was swift. Friends who had admired him stopped calling. Neighbors who once invited him to dinners avoided eye contact. No one saw him as clever anymore. They saw him for what he really was, a man who betrayed his own family to line his pocket. His name, once spoken with respect, now carried the taste of scandal. For me, the outcome was not the return of the cottage. That loss could never be undone. But I did win restitution, a settlement drawn from what was seized. The amount far exceeded the check he had tossed at me that day, the one meant to silence me. I didn't feel joy when I saw the number written out. Instead, I felt something steadier, relief. It was proof that I hadn't been wrong to fight, proof that my grandparents' trust in me had not been wasted. I walked through town with a lighter step after that. No one asked me anymore why the cottage was gone. They already knew. The truth was out in the open, and I no longer had to carry the shame alone. My father, once untouchable in his own eyes, now lived with the reality he had created. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Justice had spoken louder than I ever could. With the settlement finally in my hands, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I couldn't bring the old cottage back, but I could find a place of my own near the water, a place that carried the same quiet peace I had once known. I spent weeks searching, driving along winding roads and stopping at small lakeside towns, until I found it. It was nothing grand, just a modest cabin with weathered siding and a short dock that stretched out over the lake. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. The cabin needed work, but that didn't bother me. I painted the walls myself, sanded the floors until they shone, and filled the rooms with things that reminded me of home. In the kitchen, I placed a small wooden table like the one my grandmother and I used to sit at. On the porch, I put a rocking chair that creaked when I leaned back, and instead of feeling sad, I smiled at the sound. The place wasn't the same as the cottage, but it carried a spirit I could shape with my own hands. Every morning I walked down to the dock and sat with a cup of coffee, watching the water ripple as the sun rose. Sometimes I imagined my grandfather beside me, his fishing rod resting between us. Other times I baked in the little kitchen, thinking of my grandmother's gentle laugh. The memories still hurt, but in this new space, they no longer cut me open. They softened into something I could carry with love instead of pain. I didn't tell many people about the purchase. It wasn't about showing anyone what I had gained. It was about healing something inside myself. I wanted a place where I could breathe again, where the betrayal no longer had the final word. Sitting by the lake, I felt the weight of what I had lost, but I also felt the strength of what I had survived. My father never came to see the cabin. He lived in the shadows of what he had destroyed, and I had no reason to invite him into the life I was building. I let the distance remain. The anger I once carried cooled into something quieter, not forgiveness, but acceptance. He had taken something from me that could never be replaced, but I refused to let him take my future as well. As the seasons changed, the cabin became more than a home. It became proof that even when someone you love betrays you, it doesn't have to define the rest of your story. I mourned what was stolen, yes, but I also found new ways to honor my grandparents. Every sunrise, every pie baked in that small oven, every moment of stillness by the water felt like a promise kept. It wasn't the ending I once dreamed of, but it was mine. And in claiming it, I reclaimed not only my dignity but also my strength. The past would always ache, but it no longer held me captive. I had built a future from the ruins, and that, in itself, was enough.